Well, welcome everybody, and we are thrilled to have Amy here talking to us about pruning. Um, Again, just to mention, if you have any questions, put them in the chat function. I will do my best to get to as many as possible and organize them as best as I can. So we will have that. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Amy. Amy is a professional garden coach who helps individuals transform their outdoor spaces with expert advice and personalized guidance. With a deep knowledge of horticulture, native plants, and a passion for sustainable gardening practices, Amy empowers her clients to create sustainable gardening practices. Oh, I'm sorry, to create beautiful, thriving gardens and ecosystems. Through hands-on coaching and tailored strategies, she helps gardeners at all levels cultivate success and enjoy the rewards of their green spaces. In 2 years, she has accumulated over 200,000 followers on social media and more than 150 coaching clients across the United States and Canada. She has also been a master gardener for 9 years. I met Amy through my Instagram, Chappaqua Garden Club, and that is how we met. So Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we look forward to this presentation.
Okay, nice to meet you all. I'm going to start by sharing my screen and getting into it. Just give me a second here. Okay, so this is called pruning, and I call it the Don't Be Scared presentation because so many people that I meet are afraid they're going to do some damage by pruning. And so, as a garden coach, I really feel like my job is to empower people by giving them information, science, and evidence based information to go out into your gardens and have success with pruning. A quick little bit about me. Jennifer did a great job of introducing me. Thank you for having me, first of all. And now I know, I think, how to pronounce Chappaqua, right? Garden Center and the Chappaqua Library. Thank you for having me. I am a garden coach. You can follow me on social media. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today. I'll also have lots of videos on my page with examples of many different types of plants and trees and shrubs that I have done pruning on. I started out during the pandemic making videos for my family back home in Nova Scotia, where I was born and raised. I had some family members who had never gardened before, and I thought, well, I'll just make a video instead of trying to explain this over the phone. And the videos kind of really took off. And so that's how I ended up garnering followers, and then followers started to ask me in the Chicagoland area if I would come to their house. And so yeah, I now do garden coaching and consulting for people. I have virtual clients from British Columbia all the way to Long Island and south to North Carolina. So I've been having a lot of fun, and this presentation is really a culmination of all the master gardener training. I have a chemistry degree, so I love problem solving and the science of all of this gardening adventure that I'm on. And paired along with the common questions that come up, I saw 186 clients just this year alone in 2024, and there's a lot of very common misconceptions and mistakes being made that I have put into this one presentation. We're going to keep this to about an hour. Again, please put your questions in the chat. Jennifer Preiser is going to help me as we go through, filter through questions to me. So we'll try to get those answered. So let's get started. What is pruning? Pruning is the selective removal of specific parts of a plant, like branches or stems, to improve its overall health, shape, and growth, while also controlling its size and form. So that's the technical definition. And the first thing that I have here that I think most people don't know, and that my arborist has continually drilled into my head, we don't prune any woody plant, a tree or a shrub, for the first 3 years. And this means 3 years in their home in the ground. Doesn't matter how old the plant is from the nursery until the time you bought it, but in that home in the ground, it should be there for 3 years. All woody perennials need 3 years to create a fully developed root system. So during those first 3 years, plants need every green leaf and needle they have to make enough food to establish that healthy root system. Okay, so after 3 years, that's when your plant is considered established. And that also means that even if you transplant a shrub or a tree, now you start the clock again. You need 3 years in that location in the ground. The other thing is there's research that shows when you trim and prune the stems of branches, they also, that means the roots are also, there is a relationship there where the roots are going to slow their growth. So it's another good reason not to prune in the first 3 years. So there's four main reasons why we prune. One is to protect people and property. We don't want anything falling on our house or falling on a person. We prune for the health of the plant. We also prune for form and aesthetics. We also prune to encourage flowers or fruit. Let's start with why we protect and how we protect people and property by pruning. We want to remove dead branches. We have hazardous trees. We want to have those taken down. We want to prune out weak or narrow angled tree branches. We'll cover that in detail in a minute. That overhang homes, parking areas, sidewalks, and any place falling limbs could injure people or damage property. We also want to be sure to eliminate branches that interfere with visibility at intersections, crosswalks, streetlights, traffic signals, overhead wires. I think many of us have probably driven through new neighborhoods and almost didn't see that stop sign because, somebody's privet hedge was overgrown. So it's important to keep things pruned back for safety. And lastly, make sure we do not attempt to prune near electrical and utility wires. We want to contact our utility companies or city maintenance workers to handle those situations. So when it comes to pruning for form and aesthetic, number one, we want to make sure we maintain structural integrity of the plant, especially when it comes to trees. We want to try to maintain the tree or the shrub size. We want to try to stick to a desirable shape. And also, the one thing we got to pay attention to, we want to make sure we put the right plant in the right place so then we can let the plant be its natural size and shape without much pruning. Pruning can only do so much. There are some plants like yews and boxwoods where we can, trim them into topiary shapes and make them the size we want. That's not most plants, especially trees. So please plant for the mature size and make sure that the shrubs and trees have enough space to grow into the size and shape they want to be. Next up is encouraging flowering and fruit. Young stems produce more flowers and more fruit than older stems. This is especially true of spring bloomers like forsythia and lilacs and dogwood shrubs. Also, many fruit trees bloom on new wood. So it's important to keep that in mind that we want to continually make sure we are encouraging new growth on our flowering and fruiting plants. And this is the one that I'm particularly passionate about is pruning for health. Things to prevent disease and keep our trees and shrubs growing a long, long time. It's important to remove dead, diseased, infested, or damaged branches. That's going to prevent the spread of any disease so that it doesn't actually kill the plant. And also, we can prevent rot by cleaning up damaged branches. Windstorms and ice and snow damage often create tearing and a lot of jagged, unhealthy cuts and wounds that the plant can't heal very easily on its own. So we want to clean up those damaged areas by making proper clean cuts. Again, this is going to help with disease prevention. We also can prune in ways to prevent disease. We're going to cover that a lot today. And remember, not only do younger stems give us more flowers and fruit, they're also more disease resistant and pest resistant. So with my chemistry degree, this is the part that I love the most, diseases and how to prevent them. So let's talk about diseases. Diseases are either fungal, bacterial, or viral, and it's really hard to know exactly what kind of disease you have without sending a tissue into a lab. And it really doesn't matter because the treatment is generally the same. Um, Diseases come from pathogens. Pathogens are microscopic. It's that little microscopic fungal spore, that little bacterium. By themselves, they are not a disease. Those pathogens live in the soil, they blow in the air, they live on plant surfaces, and pathogens are good. We need them in the soil. We talk about microbial activity in the soil and how healthy it is that these microbes break down organic matter. They cycle nutrients into the soil. We just don't want them turning into a disease on on a plant, right? So pathogens become a disease when they proliferate and grow in warm, moist environments. So water proliferates and spreads disease. And that's why I put the last point here in red. This is going to be a theme throughout the rest of the presentation. We want our plants to dry out as soon as possible after they get wet so that we don't end up with this leaf in the picture here. This is a rose with cercospora or black spot disease. We need airflow and sunlight penetrating through the plants so that when they do get wet, they dry off as quickly as possible so we don't end up with diseases. This black spot disease in particular on roses is 100% caused from water droplets sitting on the leaf for 7 hours or more. Now, what happens when we prune? Well, when we cut, this is a hard prune that I did on my my limelight hydrangea in the spring. Pruning removes green leaves. So we make a cut and we cut a 5 foot long stem down to 2 feet. We've just removed the plant's ability to photosynthesize food. So when we remove parts of the canopy, the plant is immediately going to want to rebuild that canopy and repair those wounds to protect itself. And where we make the cut is where a growth hormone actually gets secreted. And the new growth that comes out to build out the new canopy will start right underneath where those cuts are made. So you can see a little bits of some green leaves happening here right under the cuts. And in fact, the next several weeks showed brand new buds coming out right under where those cut locations were made. Now, hardening off is an important term. Hardening off is when the plant pushes out new growth, new stems, that the plant hardens off enough where it can survive winter with a nice, healthy bark coating. Okay, so this picture on the left where I'm pointing to this stem, this is a limelight hydrangea stem. It's fully hardened off. This is several years old. It's got a nice, healthy, grayish, smooth bark. That bark is helping to protect the internal tissue of the plant, especially during cold winters. If we look to the right here, this is the same limelight hydrangea. I pruned it in early April. This is a picture from July 11th. You can tell that this stem is lime green. When I wiggle it around, it's very pliable. It's not hardened off. And this is 4 months after pruning. Okay. Hardening off takes 4 to 6 months, and that's important. That informs us on when we should do our pruning. If you learn nothing from me today, I hope you remember this slide. I'm not an artist, and I did sketch this on the computer. So there is a very important concept called phenology. Phenology is the energy cycle that our plants go through the seasons. And when we are well informed about what's going on inside the plant in terms of these energy cycles, that is going to help us work with the plant so that we're not stressing the plant out and we're working with the energy cycles when it comes to pruning. So if we start in the top left corner here in the summertime, okay, the summer quadrant. So here we have my nice brown stems and some green leaves, right? By summertime, the leaves have all opened. Maybe there were flowers, maybe there aren't. But when the green leaves are full and open, that's when the plant is photosynthesizing lots and lots of food. That food energy, that's carbohydrates, starches, sap, okay? That energy is being used all summer long to create, set, and open flower and leaf buds. That energy is also used to create fruit or seeds, and that energy is used to push out those new stems in the canopy. That is highly energy intensive time of year, okay? And then this arrow that's going across the top from left to right from summer to fall. These are the environmental cues that all of the plants are have evolved to pay attention to let them know it's time to change their energy cycle, okay? So by about late July, the sun angle starts to get lower, the temperatures slowly start to decrease, the days start to shorten. Those three cues, by August especially, is when the plants know it's time for me to get out of new growing phase, and it's time for me to start preparing for winter survival. Okay. So in the fall, the plants start to maximize photosynthesis. And instead of pushing out new growth, they are starting to draw all that carbohydrate and sap down from the canopy into the roots. The roots, we often think of the roots as, pushing out into the soil to get us water to drink and get the plants nutrients that they need. And that's true. But the other very important function that most of us don't know, and I didn't even know this until a couple years ago, is this is where I've added the yellow over the black roots. This is food storage. Okay. Very, very important function. We don't want to prune, and this is new for a lot of people. No pruning after the first week of August, or we say August 1st, because if we prune, we're going to be taking away green leaves in the canopy at a very essential time of year when the plant needs to make as much food to pull down into its roots for winter survival. So we don't want to take any part of the canopy away at this time of year. And the second reason is hardening off. If hardening off to survive for winter takes 4 to 6 months, we certainly don't have time in August to harden off before those cold temperatures come. So those are two main reasons why we do not want to prune any woody trees or shrubs in the late summer, okay? August for sure. Now, when we get down here, and you'll see on the right this big blue energy arrow going down. That's the energy system of fall. And then in the winter time, it looks on the surface to the naked eye like nothing much is happening. But in fact, much is going on to keep stems from freezing and dying. I was fortunate enough to stumble across a video from a researcher at Michigan State University, a microscopic view of what the cells were doing in the plant during frigid temperatures. The amount of work happening to shift salts and fluids inside of all those cells in order to keep those stems from freezing was, I couldn't believe how much energy was happening underneath the covers. So it's very, very important for us to remember that. It looks like nothing's happening, but a lot of energy is being used in order to survive the winter. You can see in my little rudimentary drawing, the yellow energy has now been cut in half in winter. And depending on what type of polar vortex might be coming, or who knows what type of unpredictable weather we're going to have, we want to make sure that we have set our plants up for being able to manage everything they need to survive winter with a big, healthy fall food storage system. Okay. Now, as we go from winter over to spring, we've got this arrow going from right to left. Now we've got the reverse happening in the environment. We've got the sun angle getting higher in the sky, temperatures are slowly starting to increase, and days are getting longer. Now the plants shift their energy cycle up. So now this yellow food storage is going down because energy is being pulled out of the roots and being pushed up into the canopy. And it's a very important point to remember that all of your spring growth, those magnolia flowers that open and all the new leaves and all the things that are happening in spring are all predicated on the food that got stored back in the fall. That's why I can't impress upon you enough to make sure fall the plants get left alone so they can make as much food energy as possible to survive winter and have enough left over to give us a healthy flush of growth in the spring. Okay? So, your key takeaways on when to prune. Don't disrupt the energy cycle. That stresses out the plant and costs the plant energy, which we don't want to do. We want to store that energy in the fall. Lots of energy is needed to survive the winter. Spring growth is predicated on how much food is left over from winter. Pruning encourages new growth. So prune when the energy cycle is pushing up into the canopy, which is in the spring. New growth takes at least 4 months to harden off. It's another reason to prune in the spring. And then the last 2 points here I want you to really think about going forward. As weather becomes more unpredictable, we need to set our plants up to be able to adapt and survive whatever Mother Nature is going to throw the plant's way. The other thing is about leaf diseases. We had a lot of leaf diseases this year because of the very wet spring. Leaf diseases don't kill plants usually, but can stress them out. So don't prune a stressed out plant, okay? We want to let the plant store its energy and work in its own natural energy cycles. So I'm about halfway through here. That was kind of the theory. So before we get into lots of examples and lots of pruning styles, Jennifer, was there anything that has come up at all that we think we should address here? Questions? Have I lost anybody? I know a lot of this is kind of new for a lot of people.
No, I think we're good. Somebody has a question about wrapping the shrub. Is that useful? Or do we
Can
not?
be useful to protect things, especially things like macrophylla hydrangeas that have little buds
Mhm.
on there that often don't survive the winters, especially plants that are in a very windy location. Wrapping
Mhm.
your plants can certainly help. As a
Yeah.
general rule, if you have a plant that's hardy in your zone
You
and should
shouldn't
be
need to
able to
wrap it.
tolerate
Right.
your weather, it's a good idea to let the plant go through all those cycles so that they'll learn how to tolerate and survive their winter. So as a general rule, we don't want to, but if you have some sensitive plants or plants in a very windy area, that can be a good idea.
Another thing is just because you mentioned a new plant don't prune for 3 years. Somebody says, what if you have branches that are rubbing up, against each other? Should you?
Rubbing, rubbing, you can still leave for the first 3 years, according to my arborist and the master gardener training, that
Okay,
you can leave that. If it's dead, you can get rid of it in
got it.
3 years. But other
Got
than
it.
that, leave the plant alone.
And then just one more so you can keep
Yeah,
going. How early in the spring can you prune?
we're going to talk about that. That's where the
Great.
tricks come in.
Okay.
That's
So
where the next slides of explaining exact. It all depends on the
perfect.
plant.
So
Okay?
we're going to let you continue, and I'm going to
Okay.
take myself off, and
Okay.
away we go.
So when this is the big question. Late winter, early spring is the best time to prune as the plant is coming out of dormancy. So that's March or April. Technically, if you have a warm day in the end of February, you could go out and prune then too if you want to. But late winter, early spring, the exceptions are spring bloomers, right? We don't want to cut the flowers off. We're going to talk about that in detail. And the other exception is oaks and birches. Okay, oak trees are very susceptible to oak wilt, which is killing thousands of oak trees. So we need to be very careful of that. And birch trees are very susceptible to pest infestations. And we only want to prune oaks and birches in the dead of winter when the sap is not running. When you prune and the sap is running, the sap attracts the insects which bring the disease or the infestation. So oaks and birches are the two exceptions. Let's talk about spring bloomers. The biggest question I get asked in the Master Gardener office, why isn't my plant blooming anymore? The answer is often that you or your landscaper are pruning in the fall or early spring. And the reason why that's a problem, spring bloomers set their flower buds for next year 2 to 4 weeks after this year's flowers. So when your magnolia opens in May and then the flowers die, about 2 to 3 weeks later, now the leaves are all open and photosynthesis happens, they start setting their buds right away. So you have a pruning window on spring bloomers is 2 to 3 weeks after the flowers die. The next slide, I'm going to give you a whole list of all those spring bloomers. So if you go outside that 2 to 3 week window, you are cutting off the tiny flower buds for next year. Okay. If you don't care about the flowers, you can cut during late winter, early spring. Some people are so sick and tired of this overgrown shrub, or they just moved into a new house and they've got these 6 foot tall 9 barks. They're sick and tired. If they're not worried about flowering, you can still prune in late winter, early spring. You're just removing the flowers. So generally, anything that blooms before June is considered a spring bloomer. Forsythia, magnolia, wigelia, cherry trees and shrubs, vernal witch hazel, fothergilla, flowering quince, viburnum, cornelian cherry trees or flowering dogwoods, lilacs, crab apples, redbuds, azaleas and rhododendrons, and 9 barks. Okay, so this is a picture of my Leonard Massell multi-stem magnolia in my backyard. This was the third, after the third year, this is the fourth spring. So after these flowers have all turned brown and fallen off, that's when I got in and did my first round of pruning on this tree. You've got 2 to 3 weeks. It's not an exact science. You'll have people say 3 weeks, I wait 5 weeks. Look, every cultivar and variety has its own window. To be on the safe side, 2 to 3 weeks after the flowers have all opened and then died off, that's when you want to get in and do your pruning to make sure that you don't prune off flowers for next year. So let's do some general pruning tips, okay? We try not to remove more than a third of the overall canopy at any given time. If you remove more than a third, that means you've taken away so much of the plant's ability to make food through photosynthesis that now the plant has to focus on rebuilding canopy. So the plant is not going to waste its energy on flowers for the next 3 years. So try to only take away a third, about a third, okay? When you back up and look at the whole shrub, you take 1 or 2 branches out and back up. How much have I just removed? All right, I can take a little bit more. So try to only take a third at a time. You can take more than a third, especially on established older shrubs. It just means you're going to lose flowering for about 3 years. Okay, we call that hard pruning or renovation pruning. You need to know what types of shrubs can handle that. Most flowering shrubs can. We don't do that to most evergreens. Evergreens don't like that. The next tip here is sharp tools make clean cuts. This is the time of year in the winter when we want to get our tools clean and sharpened. I take mine to my local hardware store. They have a sharpening service that comes and picks up the tools every Tuesday. They sharpen them in their shop and bring them back. I go pick them up on Saturday. It's very inexpensive. I recommend you get your tools professionally sharpened at least once a year. I do it in the winter so that my tools are ready to go when that late winter, early spring hits. You also need to disinfect your tools, especially between plants. I use rubbing alcohol. Those disease pathogens that we talked about that live on the plants, we don't want to spread them from one plant to another. So I always disinfect before I start pruning and in between each plant. I've got 4 roses together in front of my house. I will disinfect as I move from plant to plant. All I do is take an old rag, I lay my pruning tools on top of it and splash a little rubbing alcohol, quickly dry them off, and that's all you need to do. It's nothing complicated. And lastly, never prune when the plant is wet. That's how we spread those pathogens from one part of the plant to the other. So leave everything as it is when things are wet. I don't even touch my plants when they're wet. I make sure everything is dry before I get in there and do any kind of pruning or handling. Okay, so the basic steps that we want to follow, no matter what we're pruning. Number one, We want to remove dead, disease, infested, or damaged branches, right? That's how we want to protect people and property and protect the health of the plant. Number two, we want to prune for structure. What's the long-term shape that we're looking for? We want to remove anything growing towards a walkway or growing into the house or a fence. If this is a tree or a shrub that is by a sidewalk or the street, we may want to limb up. We generally want to leave about 10 feet of clearance for us to walk underneath trees, especially out in the parkway. And we also want to prune for strong branch angles. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But 45 degrees between the trunk and the limb, that's where the branches are the strongest. We don't want really acute narrow angles, or else those long term are the ones that are the most susceptible to splitting and damage. And then remember to work with the plant's natural shape and size. Number three, we want to prune for an open center. That is what's going to allow airflow and sunlight to penetrate the center of the plant to dry it off when it gets wet. That's how we can prevent diseases. Number four, we want to do some rejuvenation pruning to take older stems out and allow younger stems, which are more resilient to disease and give us better flowering and fruit, allow them to come up and reach into that new open space that we've created. We're going to look for crossing branches, and we're going to remove water sprouts or suckers. Those take out a lot of energy from the plant. So let's go through those in detail. Structural pruning of trees. After 3 years in the ground, we need to do structural pruning. I personally leave this up to an arborist, especially on large shade trees. Those are a big investment. I want to make sure it's done right. We're looking to get rid of weak branch angles, so less than 45 degrees. Strong branch angles are between 45 and 60. As you can see from this very first picture here, the angle between the limb and the main trunk should be 45 to 60 degrees. When we make cuts up here in the top right with all the A, B, C's and D's, we want to make our cuts on the edge of this branch bark ridge. Okay, underneath this ridge that exists between the limb and the trunk, under that bark is some cambium layer, it's called. That part, if we can cut right on the edge, this letter B here where it says yes, we cut right on the edge there. That cambium layer can grow over and completely seal up the wound. So that's why we want to make our cuts just not in A in the middle of this. We want to get right on the edge of that branch bark ridge so that we can try to engage the cambium layer to heal. This is also a really important thing to keep in mind. It's very important to prune trees structurally when they're young so that when limbs are only an inch or two across, that's an easy wound for the cambium layer to completely heal over and close. If we wait until the tree is older and now we've got 6 or 8 inches across to cut, that's a really big wound to be able to heal. And so we often don't get full closure on those wounds, and now that cut is susceptible to disease and pest infestation. Down here in the bottom right, if we look down the top, this is what scaffold healthy branches should look like. We've got lots of even spacing in between. So this is just giving you an idea of what healthy structural pruning of young trees should look like. Limbing up, we don't limb all the way up 10 feet, like right away. We take one layer off every 3 years so that the plant is filling out and growing and we're not taking too much canopy away at any given time. The other, I personally don't do the structural pruning on my trees, but I think it's very, very important when it comes to selecting an arborist that you talk to an arborist that's willing to answer your questions, like picking a good doctor who doesn't mind answering your questions, who doesn't think your questions are stupid. I ask my arborist, what are you looking for with this particular Armstrong maple I have in the backyard? Like which angles are you looking for? Which branches? Like I need to know and feel comfortable that this person is going to do the proper pruning, because I want these trees to last 50 years or more, right? An oak tree, 150, 200 years. So if we can set this tree up now, especially with climate change, we really need to make an investment in these trees. We all should be educated, even if we're not doing the pruning ourselves. And I don't let an arborist or anybody else prune or cut anything that I'm not in the window or outside with them watching. And I let them know that. So I want professionals coming onto my property that care as much about it as I do, and I want them to know that. So that's why I think even though you may not be making branch bark ridge cuts yourself, you should be watching to make sure that your arborist is doing it correctly. So here is a young tree that I pruned last year. This is called a heptacodium or seven suns flower. This was the spring in the 4th year. On the left, this is what the tree looked like after no pruning. And to the right, I made a couple structural cuts. What I did was here on the left, you can see a branch arching out towards the walking path. I don't want to encourage the tree at this height to grow towards the walking path. That's eventually going to impede walking. So I cut this branch all the way back to the base. And then I also made some cuts towards the white fence so that I don't have any lower branches that are going to grow into my yew hedge or into that fence structure. So that's the first. I didn't have any dead and diseased branches. If I did, I would have gotten those out. So this is the first step, is dead and diseased and for structure. Okay. Now, pruning a young tree for open center. So after I made the structural cuts, I now start looking at things that may crowd the center of my plant. I don't want stems that have leaves on them creating too much matted density in the center of the plant for disease prevention. So I've highlighted here in the red, some examples of branches growing into the middle, back towards the center, or any weak, thin little branches that are not giving me anything, like water sprouts. I'm also taking those out. And on the right, I'm very, very, very happy. Nothing makes me happier than seeing a well-pruned tree. I got lots of empty, clear space in here. I don't have a lot of branches crossing. That's the other thing I was looking for. We're going to talk about that in detail too. But this looks like a really nice shape. I didn't take too much of the canopy away. That's another piece of advice. When you're in here cutting away your structural pruning, make sure after each cut you back up and have a look from a couple of different angles. Make sure you're not taking away too much of the canopy. Remember, we're trying to only take a third away at a time. So I think this looks like a really good prune. I don't mind saying so myself. Okay, this is something a lot of people get wrong. They don't even know to look for it. This is crossing branches. So I'm glad to see in the chat we already had a question about this. Crossing branches, like this picture here, this is a hydrangea. We want to remove stems growing back towards the middle because they crowd the center, and they often end up rubbing and crossing other stems. And as you can see in this picture, both of these stems have rubbed the bark coating off of each stem, okay? That bark, we talked about how it helps to insulate the plant in the wintertime. The other thing the bark does is it protects the internal tissue from diseases, right? And you can start to see on this back branch some discoloring happening already on this internal tissue. This is where we run into problems with diseases infecting the entire plant. So we don't want the bark rubbing off and getting wounded. Okay, the other thing is, you think about lilacs and birches as an example. They have a lot of borer insects that will bore or burrow a hole into the internal tissue of the plant, and they'll live in there and you don't even know they're in there, and they're slowly eating away at the tissue and eventually kill that stem and sometimes kill the entire plant. So that's another reason why we want a healthy bark coating, is it protects the internal tissue from insects and pest infestations. Also pruning for an open center, I just wanted to show, I see examples like this viburnum here on the right everywhere I go. We've got crowded center, and look at all the crossing in here. This happens all the time. 2024 was one of the most wet springs we've ever had on record. And because of it, we had a lot of leaf diseases, right? We had water on the leaves. We didn't get a lot of heat drying it out right away. And that proliferated disease. A lot of that can be prevented or at least minimized with proper pruning. And by removing older wood, those plants are going to be younger and be more resilient to disease. Now, quickly on how to make a cut. Here on the left, this is a good example of a cut. Not every stem has buds like this one, but if you're pruning around buds, we want to try to make an angled cut. It says a 45-degree. It doesn't have to be 45 degrees. Don't get too caught up on the angle. We just don't want it to be really steep because you can see that's a larger surface area wound for the plant to heal. So that's going to be more susceptible to disease. In the middle here, we've cut a little too close to the bud. We don't want to damage the buds. And the fourth one here, the too high, oftentimes water will just sit on the edge of this stem and will cause dieback and death. So we'd prefer just to make an angled cut just above the bud. If you have opposite buds, there are some trees that have buds right across from each other. That's the only time we want to make a flat cut. Flat cuts have water sometimes will sit on them if the stem is up and down, and then water can sit on there and rot that cut. So as a general rule, we just want to make a slight angle. And if you are pruning something with buds, try to go above the bud, not too close. Okay? Rejuvenation pruning. Most flowering shrubs benefit from rejuvenation pruning. This is when we make thinning cuts on the oldest stems and remove the entire stem down to the base of the plant. This opens up airflow and light. It reduces size. And by removing the oldest branches, we're reducing disease risk, infestation risk. We're getting more flowers. And it allows for space for those new stems to grow up and become the next generation of stems. Here is my rudimentary drawing of rejuvenation pruning. So number one, if you just look at the overall circle of this left canopy, the whole shrub, I took out the two thickest, oldest, all the way down to the base. And on the right, this is what's left over. I didn't take more than about a third of the canopy away. Okay, and I left lots of new stems. I've got good, healthy spacing in here. The other thing I want to think about, that finite amount of energy that got created in the fall. When we look at the left image here, we have more stems than after pruning. I've gone into scenarios like that crowded viburnum I showed with all those crossing stems. The more stems you have, the less energy that each stem will get, right? Let's say I have a finite bucket of energy, call it a pound. You know, if I've got 30 stems in a lilac shrub, each stem is only going to get that pound of energy split across 30. If I can prune away a third of those stems, each stem that's left over is going to get more energy. A lot of complaints I get is that with older shrubs, the flowers aren't very nice anymore. Well, that's because you have way too many stems. That's why we want a rejuvenation prune to keep the plant healthier and give us better blooms. We also want to prune suckers or water sprouts. Those are these vertical, straight up and down, very vigorous, fast-growing stems. They use up a lot of energy. Suckers are the ones that are sprouting down here on the ground from the root system. We want to cut those back to the soil level. And water sprouts are basically the same thing, but they originate from a limb. We want to cut those back to the main stem as well. And the younger we can get on this and prune it back, the sooner, the earlier, the better. We think that these suckers and water sprouts come up after heavy pruning, especially of larger limbs. So that's another good reason to prune when your plants are young and not have to do really hard pruning of things that are overgrown. We also think that these types of suckers happen in especially the parkway when plants are under stress. Now, I'm going to talk about hydrangeas because it's one of the biggest questions I get. There are hydrangeas, so not all hydrangeas bloom the same. So we should not prune them the same, okay? These three types of hydrangeas, ideally, you don't ever prune. Unless it's dead or diseased branch, leave these alone, put them in a location where they're going to be happy, and ideally you would never prune them, okay? So on the left, we've got a climbing hydrangea. On the top right, these nice colorful macrophylla or big leaf hydrangeas. And on the bottom right, that is an oak leaf hydrangea. If you must prune, prune once the flowers are fully open. Immediately after that, the plant starts setting its buds for next year. So you don't have much of a window to prune, okay? So ideally, leave these in a location where they can reach their full size and you don't have to prune them at all. Hydrangeas that are easy to prune and very common, and I have both of these types. Smooth leaf type are called Annabelle, Incredible, Arborescence. Those are the ones on the left. They're sort of more mop head or rounded flowers. On the right, these are panicle type. Those are the cone-shaped flowers like Limelight, Quickfire, Pinky Winky, etc. We want to prune both of these in late winter, early spring. When we cut, they're going to put out brand new stems, and those new stems are going to go brand new flowers. So we don't worry about cutting flower buds off on smooth leaf or panicle type hydrangeas. Evergreens, I think this is worth talking about. We want to prune these in late winter, early spring before the new growth starts. If you do miss that new growth window, you can prune. Wait until after the new growth has pushed out, no later than the middle of July, after the new growth is completed, and only light pruning if you miss the window. Don't do your harder pruning on your evergreens in the summer. There is a dormant window in the summer when the heat comes out, when they go dormant. That's why you can do pruning in that mid-July window for evergreens only. Now, this is important. Juniper, spruce, pine, cypress, and fir. They do not create new growth on old wood. So if you cut back into that tree where there's no needles on the inside, the plant will not regenerate new growth. Yews and boxwoods do generate new growth on old wood. So you can hard prune all the way back into that dead zone and get new growth. Okay, once the sunlight hits the bark, there's buds hiding under there that will come out. Arbor vitae and cedar will produce new growth on old wood, but only when the trees are young. Okay, older arbor vitaes and cedars cannot be hard pruned. Best to just cut back into the existing green needles. Okay, leave some green on those arbor vitaes and cedars. Don't top your trees. Won't go through it, and we're running a little bit out of time. I want to get to lots of questions, but don't top your trees. This zaps a ton of energy. It leaves your plant susceptible to a lot of disease and pest infestations. It ruins the structure of your tree. It's a very bad practice. It's a really common practice to rejuvenate yews and boxwoods. I just wanted to cover it here. This is the dead zone. This is a picture of one of my clients who bought a new house, huge overgrown yew shrub. If you're willing to tolerate this ugly look for a little while, you can prune back into this, what's called the dead zone. It's technically not dead. If you have a very sunny area like this client does, you'll start to get brand new buds in the first year. By year 2, this will be filled in. If you have a shadier area, more like 2 to 3 years before this will fill in, but that's hard pruning. You don't have to do a hard prune. You can do slow rejuvenation pruning. On the first picture here, this is a new bud coming up within the first year. And on the right, this happened after my client pruned what we call a window. Okay, you can just prune little chunks every 12 inches to make a window. And when the sunlight gets down deep into that area that doesn't have any needles, up will pop some new growth. That's the same thing for a boxwood. So every 3 years, we want to prune, we want to trim the top back, and leave about an inch and a half, 2 inches of green needles and prune windows. That's going to let sunlight into the middle. And next year, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to be able to cut a little deeper now. Those needles are going to be a little deeper on the inside. And over about 3 years, we'll be able to cut that back to the desired size we want without having to go through the painful, ugly stage. This client's husband was like, no way, we're ripping the band aid off and going for it. And then his wife texted me afterwards and was like, OMG, this is not fun. This is the front of my house. So it all depends on your appetite for how long you're willing to wait. These are the tools that I like to use. Hand pruners for stems less than a half an inch. Shears are for when you have lots of thin stems like that yew hedge. You've got 10 or 20 feet, 4 feet deep. Going with hand pruner is going to take a long time. So that's when I like to use shears. Loppers are for any stem larger than a half an inch. And I love loppers that have handles that telescope and get longer so short people like me can reach a lot. And then snips or scissors for more delicate cuts. So, Jennifer Preiser, I think we have made it.
Yes, I'm coming.
It's 7:56 where you are,
No,
6:56
it's
where I am.
you're good. This was great. So informative.
Yes. So,
Really
what
so
questions do you
educational.
have?
All right, so
Um,
let's
First,
yes.
Amy, could you take it off? Oh, good, you did. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Um okay, so transplanting. When you transplant, do you still have your rule of 3 years or no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even if your plant you put a hydrangea in front of your house, it's been there for 4 or 5 years, you now want to move it, you dig it up and move it, now you reset. You need 3 years in its new home because it hasn't put a root system out in that location. It needs every leaf it has to support the plant to make food. Yeah.
And then these get a little specific. So, somebody has any tips for pruning a rose of Sharon?
Yeah, Rose Sharon blooms late in the summer. So you can go ahead and cut that back in, late March, early April. And if it's established and those can get pretty tall and overgrown, that's a plant that responds very well to being pruned. That's a plant that's even invasive in some states because of how
Yeah.
easily it seeds and spreads. That's a
Yes.
plant that's very hard to kill. So that's a good indication that it'll respond well to pruning.
Okay. Somebody's got an incredible, she pruned it in the fall. Should I skip pruning it again in the spring?
Yeah, you shouldn't need to prune it again if you've just cut it back.
Right.
And then next year, we want to leave our hydrangeas as they are, all of our shrubs. The other thing that leaving the flowers on there is a lot of insects overwinter on
Yeah.
that dead plant material. So it's also good for winter interest, gives you something to look at instead of having everything cut back so much. It also helps your ecosystem and your native insects too.
Somebody's asking, you might have touched it though. Please explain branch angles. What are they? I assume she means cross. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
So we had a slide there with I'm using my hand
Yeah.
here. This is
Yeah.
the trunk, and then we've
Yeah.
got a limb coming out, right?
Yeah.
So this is a 90-degree angle.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so once we get to between 45 and 60 here is when the wood tissue, the fiber of the wood at that angle, scientists have found that's the strongest structure. When we start getting really acute angles, that's when that branch ridge that's in the middle gets really dense and
Mm-hmm.
very unstable. And that's when long term wind will just rip that limb right
Rip it off.
off and
Yeah.
cause structural problems and eventually can kill your tree sometimes. So, yeah, the other thing about branches crossing, right? We really
Yeah.
ideally, when we back up and look at our plant, we want to see all of those main stems before. That's why it's so nice to prune when there's no leaves on the plant. So you can
Mm-hmm.
see the structure. So we
Mm-hmm.
want as many stems starting somewhere in the middle and growing outward from the center as much
Mm-hmm.
as possible. And if you have an overgrown shrub, and you're like, uh-oh, like that picture of the viburnum with all the crossing branches, it's going to take some time for you to get in there and slowly get that to a point. We say about 3 years. So you don't
Mm-hmm.
need to get in there and hack the whole thing back and renovate it to the ground and wait 3 years. You can slowly take one or two of those older branches out a year. And then over time, we want to get to a point where all the stems are growing away from the center so that nothing is crowding and then nothing is crossing. You'll see a lot of times, you back up and look at it, you'll see one branch just growing from the bottom going straight up to the middle. Well, that's going to end up crossing with those other branches growing away from the middle. That's where you get rubbing and wounding. So when you get in there and you're doing your rejuvenation pruning, I want you to get into the center and look around all your stems. You're going to be shocked at how many wounds there are. So prune for structure and health, number one, and get anything. You're going to be very surprised when you get in and look from this angle and be like, oh, wow, I have a 6-foot big gaping wound and it's getting moldy and black. That's what you're looking for to prolong the life and health of your plant for a long time.
Somebody's got a carpet rose covered with powdery mildew. Would you prune it off now or leave it until the spring?
So I would leave it, and any plant like a rose, or up here in the Midwest, we get powdery mildew on our peonies a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let those leaves overwinter.
Right.
So when all the leaves have fallen off, go out and rake, get the blower out, try to collect all that and dispose of it.
That's
so
for
that
everything. That's
that
also the
those spores
hydrangea.
are not overwintering. Yeah. And
Mhm.
then the other thing about roses,
Yeah.
it's
Tough.
best to have them planted in a location where they're getting morning sun. Roses are not native, right? Most of them are
Right.
imported and bred,
Mm-hmm.
and they're very susceptible to leaf diseases, yellowing, black spot, powdery mildew. Morning sun is very important, because if that's getting dew on them at night or water or rain, and they're sitting there overnight and they don't start getting sun really till noon or 1 o'clock, you are absolutely going to get leaf diseases on your roses.
All right, so here's a question. So if you have a sprinkler system
Yeah.
and the sprinkler system, will get it'll hit the shrubs. And so I don't know if there's a way to deal with that, but I guess what time would that go off?
Number one,
Yeah.
sprinkler systems are good for lawns.
Yeah. It's
They're
true.
not great for shrubs. Number
Right.
two, if you're
Yeah.
planting shrubs that are hardy in your zone, shouldn't
Yeah.
need to water them that often. It's another
Yeah.
reason why we have zoning in our
Yeah.
sprinkler systems, hopefully, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
everybody does, but that's why we do that. Um, if you have to have a sprinkler system around roses or other shrubs, you want to run it at right when sun comes up.
Yeah, like at 5 in the morning or 6 in the
5,
morning.
6 in the morning. Yeah. So that way, if it is wet, that
Right.
sunlight, and again, pruning, especially with roses. You
Right.
got to get in there so roses, we hard prune every stem on a shrub rose down to 12 inches
And what
in
time
late
do you do that in late
March, April. Okay.
March and
When
April?
you're done pruning everything down, and you make sure you're sanitizing your pruners and they're
Mm-hmm.
nice and sharp, making clean cuts. When you're done pruning everything down, you're taking your diseased branches all the way to the ground. Anything with that black canker all the way down. Anything wounded all the way to the ground. Everything else gets cut to 12 inches tall. And then you're going to stand over the center of the plant and look from the top down, aerial view.
Mm-hmm.
Every single stem should be growing out. Roses have all, especially
All over
carpet
the place.
roses. I've got a
Mm-hmm.
pink supreme carpet rose.
Mm-hmm.
Those things, the growth habit on them are crazy.
Mm-hmm.
In those in particular, if you see a stem coming out from the right and starting to angle to the left, cut it right
Mm-hmm.
out. We want to discourage all growth from that direction. We want it all going out.
So cut the brown to the ground and cut the other, like you said, 12 inches. And what somebody had asked me about, sometimes their roses don't have a lot of leaves on them. Like,
During the growing season,
yeah, they have flowers, but not a lot of leaves. Who knows? Okay.
well, number one, roses are the only perennial that I fertilize. I don't fertilize
Oh, oh,
anything. If you don't
oh.
have a plant that's showing you a sign of a nutrient deficiency, yellowing, needles, their leaves, things falling off, doesn't look healthy. If you don't have a deficiency, you should not be fertilizing any plant, any plant. Okay? Let me say that again. Don't put fertilizer on anything that's in the ground. Containers, different story. Perennials get their nutrients out of the fungal network from the soil. Okay? If you don't believe me, or you've always done it this way and it's hard for you to change, get a soil test. Costs about 25 bucks. Your local extension office or the state university will do it. If you don't have a deficiency, you should not be fertilizing, except roses. Roses are susceptible to disease. They need all the help they can get. So we hard prune back a shrub rose. I'm not talking about climbers.
Mm-hmm.
Shrub roses cut back to 12 inches. Dead and diseased removed. Everything growing outward and fertilized. I like granular, slow release, organic fertilizers.
Like rose tone or something.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And sprinkle that around. Follow your package instructions. Don't over fertilize. Over fertilize ends up with nitrogen, especially in our groundwater, which causes eutrophication. Bad. Okay. It's the other reason why we shouldn't be fertilizing. So fertilize at the time of pruning in the spring, and then follow your package instructions in terms of how often. Some are every 2 weeks, some are every month. Liquid fertilizers just have to be done too often, and they're often not organic. So I just like something I don't need to deal with too often. I do it on the first of the month. Mine is every month. Stop fertilizing August 1st. Nitrogen is just like pruning. It encourages new growth. We don't want new growth happening in
Mm-hmm.
late August because it doesn't have time to harden off yet. And if you don't believe me, go read all the David Austin website, the biggest rose grower in the world, Jackson Perkins. Read them all.
Mm-hmm.
That's what all the rose professionals are also saying. No more deadheading after Labor Day weekend. Okay?
Yeah. Well, here, okay, what about pruning climbing roses that are growing over a trellis? Somebody says, how far back do you prune tall roses?
So again, shrub roses, I have people with old shrub roses, bought a new house, get a 6 foot tall, huge 50-year-old rose. Same rules apply. Shrub rose, hard cut it back. I will cut my roses back, and mine are carpet roses, and they'll still be 4 feet tall and wide by the time the middle of summer comes. Okay. So shrub roses, all of them, hard cut back.
Do you
Okay.
use compost? If you don't fertilize, do you use compost on other things?
Yeah.
Well,
In fall sometimes I'll put a layer of compost down. Yeah.
uh,
But we wanna compost the whole bed. We want to
yeah,
feed the whole bed, right?
yeah,
So then the taller climbing roses, right? In the fall is when I get the most growth on my climbing roses. So some of them are,
yeah,
extra 3 feet tall all of a sudden.
yeah.
We just want to tie those up for safety so that they're not blowing around in the wind and getting damaged. Then we want to come out and prune in late winter, early spring. A good rule of thumb for climbing roses is you want 4 to 6 main canes coming out of the base. Okay,
Okay.
so what we talked about there with the rejuvenation pruning is each plant has its own bucket of energy for the year. So we don't want to spread that energy over 15 stems. We'd rather do it over 4 to 6 healthy stems and get lots of horizontal branching off our climbers. That's how the horizontal shoots, when we train them on an angle, that's where we get lots of flowers. So 4 to 6 canes, prune out anything old and unhealthy, cut it all the way to the base, and let new climbers take over. Yeah, 4 to 6.
And what about for lilacs that are not blooming? Like an older lilac that's not blooming, you would take out probably a third of the bigger um,
Yeah. Lilacs not blooming
stems.
are generally caused by improper pruning at the wrong time,
Right,
right? So landscaper just comes through with the hedge trimmers and trims
right,
everything in
right,
September, and next thing you know, all your bloomers don't bloom anymore, or they don't bloom much.
right.
Lilacs really, really benefit from rejuvenation pruning. So I had a client with a 50-foot row in a house she just took over along the pool. Beautiful, but overgrown, didn't look very healthy. So instead of paying somebody to take them out, they just said, screw it, we'll just cut it down for now. So they took a
Back
chainsaw
the whole thing.
to the ground. 3 years later, these things are 5 feet tall and
Oh,
glossy and
awesome.
beautiful.
Beautiful.
So
Mhm.
if you are willing to
Mm.
sacrifice 3 years, you can cut them all the way down to the ground and a lilac will come back.
Mhm.
I'm somebody that's a little more conservative and doesn't
Conservative.
want to live with it looking like that the whole time.
Yeah.
So, yes, take about a third of those thickest, most damaged stems all the way down to the ground as far as you can get. Let those younger stems take
Come
over.
up.
Sometimes we want to let a few suckers grow up,
Mhm.
from the base and let them become the new generation of stems. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But be sure to only prune in that 2 to 3 week window after the flowers are done.
After
Lilacs
this.
also benefit from deadheading,
Oh, really?
but depending, like I've got one that's 8 feet tall and wide, I'm not deadheading
Yeah,
that thing.
right. Yeah.
No.
Sometimes they like lime. I was told give them lime if they're not flowering.
Depends. Be careful where you
Yeah.
live. We live in the
Yeah.
Midwest here. We have very
Yeah.
basic clay soil. If I add
Yeah.
lime, I'm going to make it more basic, which is not good.
Yeah. Okay.
You guys have acidic soil because on the east area, your soil is based generally on
Mhm.
granite or along the coast. So
Yeah.
things are a little more acidic that way. So
We have
depending
a
on
lot
where
of
you live
clay.
and what your soil is like, there's various
Yeah.
kinds there. Some have some
Yeah.
sand
Yeah.
in New
Yeah.
York. So yeah, that really is going to alter your pH. So be careful with that. Again, soil tests, $25. Get a soil test. So
Yeah.
easy. And this is
Easy.
it's a little frozen out here now in Chicago. I don't know what your temperature's like, but towards the end of the season's a great time to do it because then you've got the winter to kind of digest it and decide if you need to make any adjustments to your soil. The lab will also give you very specific instructions like for the next X amount of years, add lime at this
Yeah.
rate of 1 pound per 100 square feet, right? So they'll give you really
Yeah.
specific instructions.
Yeah. We have clay because we're not near the coast or anything.
Yeah,
Someone's asking on big leaf hydrangeas after they turn dry brown, do you cut them off?
no.
No. Um, what about a boomerang lilac?
Yeah,
Boomerang
bloomerang.
lilac. When do you
Yes.
prune?
So a bloomerang lilac, and there's some spireas that are hybrids that bloom on new. So they'll bloom in the spring and then they'll come back and bloom again in the summer.
Uh-huh.
Treat those like a spring bloomer.
Okay.
Prune them within 2 to 3 weeks of that first flower flush coming out. Again, ideally, we don't prune those plants at all because there is no real ideal window when we're not going to lose some flowers. If you must prune a bloomerang, do it after the first spring flowers have died off. You will the years that you do that pruning, you will delay the summer bloom because the plant's now going to use some energy to repair. So don't be surprised that yours now comes out a few weeks later. That will happen in the years that you prune.
Yeah. All right. What about a panicle hydrangea that you prune in spring, but they flop from the big blooms?
They're hydrangeas. That's what
Yeah,
they do.
exactly.
I was
That's
in
what they do.
Japan
You
in
have to cut.
July. They
Yeah.
grow up out of the ground and flop. That's just what they do.
When do you prune brown branches from black dragon cryptomeria? Will the pruned areas send out new growth?
The pruned
Getting more
areas will not
specific.
send out new growth. So that's why we don't
Okay.
want to prune too hard into those
Okay.
dead zones. But if you've got a totally dead branch, you've got to cut it out. You can cut that out whenever.
Okay. I think we're good.
And back to the panicle hydrangeas. I mean, that's a plant that responds really well to pruning. So
Yeah.
like in the picture I showed mine, mine's probably about 5 or 6 years old. I mean, that thing was about 6 or 7 feet tall. I mean, I cut it all the way down to 2 feet, cleaned up, made sure nothing was crossing. Um,
Oh, here's one. If you have a limelight tree and
yep.
you have like knots, right? Typically, do you know what I'm talking about? Like where things come together, more like a knotting. Do you prune below that or leave it above it?
So anything that's growing on a standard or a stalk has
Mm-hmm.
been grafted.
Yeah.
So we don't ever want to cut below where the
That
stems are coming out from the trunk. Don't cut into the
okay.
trunk. Yeah.
Don't kind of keep it above that.
Yeah. So from that where the stem and the tree trunk meet.
Where there's a few of them.
Yeah, you can cut back to, about 12 inches from there. Those plants love to be pruned. They'll give you 3 to 4 feet of new stem length in
And
one
don't cut
year.
below where it's clumped. I don't know what that's
Yeah,
called.
don't cut below where the standard has been
Yeah,
grafted with the stems coming up.
grafted. Got it. All right, I think we're good. This was great. So informative. Thank you so much.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you for
Yeah,
having me.
really good.
Oh,
Well, thank you.
it was just wonderful. I just have one question which really doesn't relate to outdoor plants. I'm thinking about indoor plants. Were many of these statements that you said, don't do this, don't do that, do they apply to indoor plants?
No,
No. Okay.
no. Now, most of those indoor plants, I was just in Singapore, and it was crazy to go through the botanic gardens and see these huge 8 foot tall plants. And I was like, that looks like a monstera. That looks like a philodendron. Those are tropical plants. And in the tropics, they don't have seasons because on the
Oh,
equator,
yeah, that's true.
as the planet orbits around the sun, it's not tilted, so it never changes its distance from the sun. So those plants are tropical plants that are used to getting sun and heat and humidity all year round. So yeah, those plants generally we don't
It
prune.
was a few indoor plants, but that's like for another
It
topic.
is.
So,
You know,
Yeah.
yeah, I
it's
sort of,
amazing how logical it was, the way you
yeah,
explained it in the beginning about the seasons, and then you could just sort of figure out exactly what you're supposed to be doing. And
Yeah.
just right now, what you said about tropical plants, it makes sense. And once something makes sense, it's easy to follow the regulations and
it's
rules.
true. When
Yes,
you
that's
know why
exactly
you're
right.
doing something.
Yeah, you've
Right.
been empowered to make an intelligent choice for yourself. The other thing I just want to point out is a lot of these naturalistic plantings and all these famous designers now. I'd love for all of us just to normalize winter interest in our gardens, right? There's little birds that still need the place to come in and get respite from the wind and the storms. We're having crazy wind here today. Like we need to be thinking about insects and wildlife as they survive in our gardens. We've taken away so much of their habitat that I'd love for all of us to love to learn to enjoy the winter season in our garden, right? Brown is a color. All those different shapes, the snow, the little birds coming in and perching and getting shelter, insects overwintering in there. Those things are very, very important. So for us to just get away from the idea that our everything's supposed to be pruned and mulched and clean. I know it's sort of what we have grown up with, especially out here in the suburbs of Chicago, but it'd be really nice for us to, without everything looking like a wild overgrown mess, I think we can do things that are more ecologically sustainable and healthy. And it comes a lot from us learning to just get comfortable with what nature looks like.
I think you're asking us to be stewards for all seasons, not
Hey,
just you like that
Yes,
one.
yes,
Yeah,
that's
right.
yeah.
true.
And
Perfect.
those insects come
Right.
back and eat all the aphids that are
Right.
infesting my roses. So, like, it also benefits me. It also means I don't need to resort to spraying chemicals every week. I don't want to do that. I don't want to. My hand gets cramped up. It's $15 a bottle for some. I mean, I'd rather not do that.
You can't
A,
keep
for
up
the
with it.
environment. B, it's less work and money. So, like, there's also other reasons why these sustainable practices benefit us.
Mhm.
Well, Amy, thank you so much. I'm so glad I met you.
Yes, me too. This has
And
been so fun.
this was
Great.
a wonderful, and this will be a
Thank
wonderful
you, Joan.
recording too.
Great.
So remember, if you didn't have, if you had some relatives or friends who couldn't attend this program, tell them to go to the Chappaqua Library website and they will be able to find it. Our website is chappaqua.library.org, and you just click on events, and you will see, if you look to the right on the purple scroll, you will see recordings, and just look for Chappaqua Library programs.
What does it take? Like
So
a week to get up, Joan? A week to get on?
it depends. Sometimes she does
Okay.
it overnight, depends upon our editor's busy schedule.
Yes.
She's very busy, but
The
this
other
was
thing I would
just
just add at the end here is it is often very helpful for people, not to plug my own social media, but it is really nice to get a video, to actually see me walking through making decisions as I prune.
mhm.
So again, late winter, early spring, you're going to see a lot of pruning videos. I'm going to cover roses more than once, climbing roses, all those things that I have here, clients of mine. So it is nice sometimes to take all this information you just saw and then get to watch me walk through it in a couple of minute video. And then you can also comment. I respond to comments, I respond to direct messages. So it's also a good way to learn, is from being able to see a video.
Yeah, well, you've been very generous with your time and certainly with all this information. And this is a good time to have it because, everybody's going to get antsy soon with the winter and everything. And you're
Yes.
thinking about, oh, what could I do now? What could I do? Well,
Yep, exactly. And don't forget to get those tools sharpened. And if you
Thank
don't
you,
have the right
Amy.
tools, this is a good time to put them on your holiday wish list.
That's right. There you
that's
go.
right.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you,
You're very
everybody.
welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you,
for
Chappaqua Garden Club. Thank you,
Yes.
Amy. Thank you, Jennifer, for supporting us for everything.
Yep.
And
Thank you. Nice
hope
meeting
to
you,
see you.
Jennifer.
We have lots of
too.
programs. There are many programs at the Chappaqua Library. Please go to our website and see. Many of them are online, just the way this one was, and you could enjoy them too. So goodbye, everyone, and have
Good
a
night.
wonderful holiday season.
Thank you.
Have a
Bye,
good
everyone.
night, everybody. Thank you.